right, my AP literature friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And I have FRQ1 from the 2024 exam, set 2 on Summer by George Moses Horton. And here's what I'm going to do with this for those that are unfamiliar with my work. I want to show you kind of how I expect my students to write come May, come time at the exam, while manipulating and pulling the strings of my heuristics. And I know there's a big glut of teachers in the AP community, both Lang and Lit, that use templates. And I'm going to show you something a little different. And they're called heuristics. And I know that a lot of folks are unfamiliar with that term. And I'll unpack it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to model 3 times how to do the inverted thesis heuristic. All right, so how to do the introductory paragraph. From there, we're going to transition into the body paragraphs, and I use an Aristotelian heuristic called the syllogistic method, which is pretty cool. And then I'll show you some of the conclusion stems that my students use to wrap up the end of their essay and tag a conclusion paragraph onto it. So sit tight, strap in, I'll walk you through the whole process. Before I do, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Beneath in the links of the description, you can download all the slides you're about ready to see, and feel free to grab those and spread the word far and wide to friends, colleagues, and students. So help us grow, and please leave some comments too, because I had some uncertainty about this poem. I thought it was really tricky, and there were some aspects to it that had me scratching my head. So first, let's take a look at the prompt and see what the College Board hurled at us this year. So it says, in George Moses Horton's poem On Summer, published in 1829, the author describes multiple aspects of summer in a rural area. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Horton uses literary elements and techniques to develop a complex, and here's the kicker, a lot of my students came back and they're like, oops, I overlooked that, complex portrayal of the setting. So it's kind of common fodder prompt for, FRQ1, but they do have to spend a significant amount of time looking at, how the setting is portrayed. So let's ask ourselves the first question as kids are looking at a blank sheet of paper or their blank screen. So how do I write the introduction? And here's the kicker. At this stage of the game, come test time, my students should know intuitively and instinctually how to do this, because I do things a little different. So I always tote this adage, you got to Bob Ross your instruction. So as a lead teacher at the National Writing Project, one of the things that I really emphasize with teachers is the fundamental difference between assigning writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. So oftentimes, especially in the earlier stages of the academic year and into the middle portions, I'm at my proverbial easel and canvas painting with and for my students. So they're seeing me write. Either I will write before class and have my exemplars and models done, or I do it live on the spot in front of them. And I know that terrifies and freaks out a lot of teachers, but it's a really good practice and it helps demystify the process. And just like Bob Ross, we're going to use heuristics, and his heuristic, like his magic bullet, was the wet on wet technique. So every time he tackled a natural landscape, it was always wet on wet. But let's jump back just a second to that prompt. There's breaking secret news about that. Implicit in every FRQ1, and it's also true of FRQ2, and I'll tackle that writing workshop next for set 2. So implicit in the prompts, you got 2 questions, and the first is, what is the author's intent? So some teachers call that theme, exigence, universal truth, whatever, however you want to phrase it. And then the second question is, how does the author construct meaning? So if we look at that kind of from a graphical point of view, it's sort of like an upside down triangle. right? So you end with the thesis, right? So here's what it is. There's a little bit of math involved in this, and heuristics tend to get a little mathy. So there's 4 sentences, all of my, for all FRQs on the lit exam. My students are to house everything in 4 sentences. So the first 3 sentences are the context and the background, like you heavy focus on the universal truth. And then you end with the thesis, and that's the sentence where you're going to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And you're going to focus like on the most salient, germane literary terms, devices, techniques in there. There's other things that I have my students sprinkle in. I do intensive word study academies throughout the academic year. So at this stage of the game, I want to see a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. I just simply mean by that like your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I want kids to stay in their wheelhouse. I don't want them to, sound pretentious or contrived, force the issue. Stay in their lane. And then I also run intensive nuance academies. And an aspect of that nuance academy is the idea that Strunk and White dropped in their seminal text, Write It Right. It's called rule number 18, that the idea that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. But further than that, there's 20 different ways to pattern it. So, I want my students to be syntactical ninjas and really hone in on how to achieve voice rhythm and flow. So I think that tier 2 coupled with the sentence constructs and then the organizational structure of the thesis just helps the kids stay in contention for that elusive sophistication point. So before I show you exemplar 1, let's just recap this. 3 sentences, authorial intent, 1 sentence, construction of meaning, and lead in that order. So here's number 1. I'll read it from top to bottom and then I'll unpack it for you. The transition from summer into autumn is situated upon an interesting fulcrum. On one hand, the seasonal shifts symbolically encapsulate things such as plenitude, ripening, and abundance, qualities and traits that are brimming with life. Conversely, the metamorphosis of these 2 seasons can likewise signify things such as decay, decline, old age, even death. Horton, in his poem On Summer, portrays such a conflicted setting through subtle syntactical maneuvers, a strict enumeration of nature's natural cadence, and several mythological and astrological allusions. So first, let's identify the thesis, because that's probably the most important thing. Again, it's an inverted thesis. So last sentence answers that question about the construction of meaning, and you can see a focus on the most significant terms, devices, techniques, and elements. So the first 3 sentences really hammer home and hone in on the universal truthiness of the poem, the exigence of it, the authorial intent. In terms of vocab, it's elevated without gooning out. In terms of sentence flow and sentence constructs, it's really nice. So, come game time, come exam time, I want my students to be able to wield semicolons and colons and dashes and use parentheticals and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then in terms of sentence patterning, let me just give you a little teaser, and I got videos in my YouTube channel on this. So I want my students to do like some nice layering and patterning. So you can see plenitude, ripening, abundance. So we call that a trio, right? Where you delineate by 3s. And then when you're doing the converse, you throw down decay, decline, old age, death, right? So you just layer different patterns in the sentence. And I think that adds an element to the students writing that typically when I read student samples, a lot of kids don't do that. They don't get to that level come exam time. So that's perfectly executed in terms of an inverted thesis. Might be a little nebulous and pie in the sky, so let's do it again and look at exemplar number 2. I'll follow the same protocol. Nature, despite her bountiful beauties and wonders, has a terrifying dominion over her creatures. All things that are granted life are bound to play by the rules of the forever spinning wheel of life, and as such, all living things will one day face an expiration date. The four seasons are a constant reminder of this fact, especially the transition from summer, when life is at its prime, to autumn, when life begins its descent toward death. Horton, in his poem On Summer, portrays such a conflicted setting through subtle syntactical maneuvers, a strict enumeration of nature's natural cadence, and several mythological and astrological allusions. Literally doing the exact same thing. 3 plus 1, hit the thesis statement home, in the last sentence by focusing on the construction of meaning question. First three sentences get to the authorial intent question. Vocab is nice, sentence structures are flowing. So you can see in this one, a couple of parenthetical statements, and that's what I'm talking about. So that needs to be explicitly taught, and that, just Bob Rossing that a lot over the course of the year ultimately leads to kids transferring it over into their writing and emulating my lead. So yes, you can. I know some teachers look at this and say, it's crazy hard, Kristian, but it takes practice. You got to model it and practice, practice, practice. So here's a third one. And again, we're just going to go 3 plus 1 inverted. On a metaphoric level, the seasons of life are often correlated to the cyclic quality of the four seasons. As such, summer is commonly associated with the peaking bounty of life's apex, and conversely, autumn signifies the transitional phase toward one's inevitable endpoint. But sometimes, as ironic as it may be perceived, this pivot point from summer to fall is a time of abundant aliveness. Horton, in his poem On Summer, portrays such a conflicted setting through subtle syntactical maneuvers, a strict enumeration of nature's natural cadence, and several mythological and astrological allusions. Same old thing, right? Last sentence is the thesis. Nail construction of meaning. First three sentences provide the context and background and get anchored in the authorial intent. Vocab's cooking, sentence constructs are cooking. And that's the magic, of this inverted thesis heuristic. If kids do it right, they'll yield and produce something like that, ideally. So kids, if you're following along and want to give it a whirl, give it a whirl. 3 plus 1, try your hand at it. So we still have a lot of essay to write. And the next logical question becomes this. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And I have alluded to this. We're going to proceed syllogistically. Let me give a quick flyby, like a cursory overview of this so that you got a working knowledge. So, the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemic, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And, several of you are familiar with the seminal text, Plato's Republic, in which they have an essential question: what is justice? So the whole book is written syllogistically, right? So political think tanker steps up to the mic and he drops his definition of what is justice. And it proceeds premise, premise, conclusion. And Aristotle basically wanted to teach students how to think cogently. And we as composition teachers, that's our goal, right? Get that brilliant thinking captured brilliantly on paper. And that transference is all, often tricky. And this is where, heuristics can play a big part. So there's a little bit of math to this, right? It's kind of computative in how you argue. So let me give you an example. If I say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you all nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you are right. If I follow it up with a second premise that goes like this, look where the conclusion leads us. If I'm like, yeah, I had some rats in my house and I put some arsenic beneath my sink, and this morning, little Skipper's beneath the sink and he comes out and he's got white stuff all over his gruzzle and his muzzle. Like, you're naturally going to conclude, oh my goodness, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for little Skipper. Your dog's going to die, right? That's a cogent argument. In composition, and especially in AP parlance, we call it line of reasoning. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get our kids to do in these body paragraphs. Like that's an essential aspect. That's like half the battle. So how do we morph Aristotle's heuristic and turn it into something to perform literary analysis? Here we go. First premise is going to be an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques. I'm going to give you more math on this. I want that first premise to be 3 sentences, and I'll model it. Here's the reason why. When I read College Board sample papers, students from across, the nation, I often see them lead with summative topic sentences. And my antennae go up and say, uh-oh, kid, you ain't meeting the demand of the assignment. You are doing plot analysis, and the demand of the assignment is to perform literary analysis. So the old FRQ1 on AP Lang used to say, keep your argument central. Your argument must be central. We got to keep in mind, this is all expository writings. All 6 FRQs, Lang and Lit, expository writing. So kids have to argue. So if they take 3 sentences, it's kind of a safeguard that precludes them from falling into plot summation, writing cliff note summaries of the poem. So I'll model that in just a second. So the 4th sentence begins the 2nd premise. So no quotes, no paraphrases in those leading 3 sentences. So save the quotes, save the paraphrases for the 2nd premise. And this is going to take the shape of textual support. I tell my kids, ideally, I like to see a good teeter-totter balance between the quoting and the paraphrasing. And then body paragraphs also need to be concluded, right? So you're going to wrap it back to the prompt, wrap it back to the thesis. One last piece of math. This is going to take 10 to 12 sentences. So here's my contention, and I know some teachers are like, Kristian, you're an idiot for saying that, but I'm going to stay firm to this. I've been teaching Lit for 22 years, and my students have done this since day 1 with me. So my students only write 4 paragraphs. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. We've never been penalized for that whatsoever. In taking 2 body paragraphs that shoot for 10 to 12 sentences, it's sufficient, it's ample space to analyze the totality of the poem. But here's the other thing, and I'll show you this with the first premise in just a second. It precludes kids from going 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph metaphor, right? So that's too dutiful and elementary, and I don't think it's going to bode well in the kids' score. So that's my rationale. All right, let's jump in and look at this body paragraph. We've got to ask ourselves, what's that first premise look like? Ta-da, I got it. Let me begin by saying this. Students often ask, Mr. Kuhn, where do I begin my analysis? And I always tell them to start where the author starts. Go chronologically through the poem, and this is true for FRQ2 as well, and have a sequence, have an order, like take a methodological approach to it and go top to bottom, cross weave when necessary. The other caveat that I have is this. If the student explicitly stated the term device technique in the thesis statement, and they got to mention it again in the first premise, then imply it or use a synonym. You don't want any redundancies. And again, if you implied in the thesis, maybe you want to go explicit in the first premise, or again, use synonyms. So look how this goes. Right from the onset, there's much attention given to the setting's color scheme, as well as the temperature in order to contextualize the pivot point from one passing season into the next. Further, Horton also takes great liberties at the syntactical level with the frequent employment of semicolons, most notably, to accentuate his unique perspective of the natural events unfolding. To solidify his portrayal, there are a number of key allusions that work in unison with the regular enforced rhyme scheme. So you can see there's like a teeter-totter balance between explicit, implicit for the terms, devices, techniques. So that lead sentence is really hammering the exigence and the theme, right? But it also, in a way, it sets me up to capture the setting and some of those more like subtle nuance is in the poem. And then I always tell my kids this: the first premise is a promise. If you state it, you therefore got to go get a quote and or paraphrase to substantiate your argument. So based on what I'm saying here, based on my premise, based on my promise, I got to analyze syntax, in particular those semicolons. I got to take a look at the allusions and the rhyme scheme, right? So this is what I mean by multitasking. Kids can't do one paragraph tone, one paragraph metaphor, etc. It's more ambitious, right? So from here, we're going to hop into the second premise, fourth sentence. So students got to go fetch their support, keep the promise of the first premise. So my guys usually stop here, get back into the poem, look at their annotations, and just align everything conceptually before diving into the second premise. So check this out. Look at the line of reasoning in terms of how it stays intact. Immediately, even though Estaville is in a transitional phase, the late summer fire begins to burn torrid flames. Yet this heat stands in contrast to the auburn fields in harvest rise, right? So usually fourth sentence, I start quoting unless I have, it calls for a paraphrase. Let me talk about my rule or my heuristic within the heuristic to embed the quotes. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student takes a minimum of 5 words, doesn't have to be exactly 5 words, but typically 5 words or more, and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. But this is a really cool quote because in one sentence, there are 4 quotes. Well, 3.5 quotes because I have the ellipses there, right? I don't see students, by and large doing this when I look at, college board work. Again, I want my kids to be in contention for the sophistication point. This is a really like advanced college level type thing to do. But if you Bob Ross it for kids, they can reproduce it. So again, go back to the promise of the first premise. This quote aligns with the first promise in the first sentence of the 3 of the first premise. So you quote, you got to analyze. Even though summer is reaching its endpoint, it is not quite ready to yield to the inevitability of autumn's certain coming. As is evident, the 2 seasons are in collision with each other, both in terms of hue and climate. And through an astrological illusion, Horton characterizes this raging and burning sun as a perspiring Cancer who lifts his head and roars terrific from on high, to indicate the gist of the tug and pull that both summer and fall are engaged in. I promised you illusion. There you go. Quote and or paraphrase for it, right? So I'm just kind of, proceeding through my analysis, my support, by holding true to the promise of the first premise. So you quote and you analyze. However, nature, her or mother, has a foreboding quality to it, whose voice the timid creatures dread, and even the boldest of nighthawks do battle with to dive away the gloom of fear. Pardon me. So I'm just keeping order here. As I said, I got to go on to the next slide because I'm out of space. Look at how the rest of this continues because I still have a few more promises to keep. And these apparent contradictions are at the heart of Horton's depiction of this setting, right? And again, you got to stay true to the prompt. You got to keep the analysis anchored there. Nature wears a few different faces, which let sportive children well beware, but is also simultaneously 'tis paradise to human sight. The erratic rhyme scheme, as well as the odd and frequent use of the semicolon, further advance this contradiction in terms. While some rhymes are natural and others are forced, so is Mother Nature unpredictable. Further, just as many stanzas continuously run on with multiple semicolons and commas, so does the setting mirror this, because just like some summers, they likewise trespass into autumn's rightful territory. So I posted in a few of the AP Lit Facebook groups, hey guys, what's going on with that semicolon? So my kids came back and we do a lot of syntax analysis, and they're like, I had trouble like coming up with a hypothesis for the semicolons because my adage is good observation. So what? So they made the observation that there were a ton of semicolons in there, but you got to come up with a so what, right? And I gave a stab at it there. I would love to engage in a conversation with AP Lit teachers about my particular read on this because I haven't heard anyone in the circle comment on those semicolons yet. I think that's a good hypothesis. It's the best gander I got. And it's all connected thematically back to the thesis and the exigence of the piece. So I think it works. So now at this stage of the game, I got to tie a quick conclusion on this. I got to conclude the thought. And this usually just takes like 1 or 2 sentences. I tell kids don't go more than 3, otherwise, you're just kind of bloviating. So this is the tag conclusion to the body paragraph, to the syllogism. Whether seasonal or a passing phase of life, transitions are often characterized like this. They are on one hand separate things, but also one and the same in a big overlapping convolution of contradiction and bewilderment. Done. So I went over 12 sentences. I think I hit like 14. No big deal. I tell my kids, you don't want to go on into like 18, 19, 20 sentences. That's way too long, right? So, but if you go a little over, a little under, it's a-okay. And I kept the line of reasoning. So that's all fine. So again, kids playing along at home, pause, give it a try, and see what you can cook up. Next question, because we have intro done, first body done. And I already said we got 4 paragraphs. So the question becomes, what do I do next? You bust out another syllogism, right? You just follow the same heuristic, follow the same math, right? So we're going 4 paragraphs, and you got to ask yourself what's left. So you're going to have a first premise, that's 3 sentences. And you're going to take the terms, devices, techniques that are left. In terms of my writing this, I was about at the middle of the poem, in terms of proceeding chronologically. So I still have the rest to do. 4th sentence, transition into the second premise. Teeter-totter balance the quotes and paraphrases. Use the 5-word rule to embed the quotes seamlessly and flawlessly. Tag a conclusion on that syllogism at the end. Shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. But let's talk about what's left, because I know some students struggled reading this a little bit. So a couple of the things my students saw, and my students took AP Lang first before AP Lit, and they said, Mr. Kuhn, there was a lot of enumeration in that, and that's kind of germane to AP Lang. And I was like, absolutely, talk about it. It is he kind of lists, so enumeration's cool. Tons of stuff going on with sound. I was pretty fascinated by that. And then the natural imagery. That semicolon is doing all sorts of erratic things in the rest of the poem. In fact, it disappears in one stanza, so they can revisit that. You still have some mythological allusions. And then I found some diction in it that I thought was pretty interesting. The use of paradise and rapture. And I was like, is it too much to say that we're getting into a little bit of biblical diction? I don't think so. Those are definitely rooted in the Bible. And then 2 instances in which the smiles are dropped. I think it's very interesting to compare, contrast, juxtapose both those smiles. So that's some of the terrain that kids can go in that remaining body paragraph. All right, let's wrap the essay up and talk about how to do the conclusion. So early in the academic year, I give my kids some conclusion stems. Ultimately, come exam time, I don't want them using it. I really don't like contrived prescriptive things. But in a constrained time situation, some of my students default back to these. And I liken the conclusion paragraph to this. It's kind of like the grand finale of a fireworks display, that all encapsulating, all encompassing, thematic aha moment. And I think, clauses like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, in a global sense, get kids into that spirit of the grand finale. So again, I just want conclusions that are like 3 or 4 sentences long, and they don't have to go on, all that much. And here's a look at one for this particular poem. In no other words, nature can best be described as fickle. While she brings life to life, she also makes the concept of death a reality for all living creatures. Simultaneously breathtakingly beautiful and hauntingly terrifying, These apparent contradictions are at the essential core of her essence, for better or for worse. Boom, done, right? 4 paragraphs. So hopefully that makes sense. I probably should have said this at the beginning. I thought this was one of the more difficult, challenging poems that I've seen in a long time. There's a lot in there, and for me, I was like, ooh, I got to up my poetry game a little bit with my students, because I think the poems the last few years, for my kids with how much poetry we did, for the better students, they were kind of softballs. They got it immediately. They read it very accurately, ascertained the meaning, and shred it. But this one was a little tricky. So I'm going to sign off. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for any reason, you can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I also have a website, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. And many of you know me from the ELA circuit. I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, have presented for NCTE, do a little bit of work for applied practice, perfection learning. And one of the things that I'm offering now is something called the Teach It Right 5-week one-to-one mentorship. So at the end of all of our professional development with the National Writing Project, we asked teachers to give us feedback. And one of the overwhelming things was, Kristian, man, I wish I could work with you one-on-one, or you could just work with our department because we have specific needs and wants. So that's what I'm offering. So if you want to work one-on-one, delve into my Word Study Academy, my alternative grading methods, my Nuance Academy, how I tackle all the expository modes, deep dive into the heuristics and the Bob Rossing concepts, drop me an email and we'll talk specifics. There's plenty of details on the website. I know another frequent comment was, man, I don't have time for all this. I'm a teacher. So I made a self-paced course. Super thorough, goes over everything. Again, email me if you have any questions about that or want to, hop on a Zoom and take a look beneath the engine of that. And then with perfection learning and NWP in particular, I offered a lot of my alternative grading method 2-hour intensive. And again, the overwhelming feedback was, man, oh man, Kristian, I want to do that one-on-one because my grading needs are so specific. So if you want to work on reclaiming your evening and weekends and managing your grading load and ditching, you don't necessarily need to ditch it if you're wedded to it, but having a different paradigm, a different alternative to the traditional grading method, again, drop me an email and we will talk. So I'm going to go through both sets of the AP Lit exam, set 1, set 2. So subscribe to the channel and I will post those to my YouTube channel as I record and write them. So that's the end. Be well. We'll see you soon.